Arabian nightmares. Dark true crime stories that will haunt you. Hook. Imagine being trapped in a world where darkness follows you, no matter how hard you try to escape. The door opens, but are you truly free? Stay with me till the end to discover what happens when fear refuses to let go. This is a journey you won't forget. The desert wind howled through the narrow alleyways. A cold gust of sand bit at her face. Mira pulled her scarf tighter, eyes scanning the shadows. She didn't like being out this late, but there was no turning back now. Her footsteps echoed off the stone walls, the only sound in the oppressive silence. The moon hung low, a sliver in the dark sky, barely lighting her path. She stopped. Something was off. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on her. A low, guttural sound came from the darkness ahead. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Then a figure emerged. A man, draped in tattered robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. His presence was unsettling. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. Myra's heart raced. She tried to move, but her legs felt like stone. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. No response. The wind picked up again, swirling around her. She could feel his eyes on her, even though she couldn't see them. The tension thickened. Suddenly, the man stepped forward, his pace slow but deliberate. Mira stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly before her. She had to get away, but every step felt like wading through thick mud. The man was closer now, his presence suffocating. She glanced over her shoulder, and for a brief second, she thought she saw something moving behind him. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it another figure? A shadow? She couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. She had to run. Her body screamed for movement, but fear kept her rooted in place. The man reached out a hand. Frozen. Myra's scream tore through the air, but it was too late. The darkness closed in. The man's hand brushed against her arm. Cold, like death. Mira gasped, her breath sharp in her throat. Her skin prickled, every hair standing on end. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. His fingers felt like iron. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. The alley twisted around her, bending in ways it shouldn't. The shadows seemed to stretch, expanding into something alive. She couldn't breathe. Her chest was tightening, squeezing, like something was sitting on top of her. She struggled, but it was no use. His grip only tightened. She could hear his breath, ragged, deep. But it wasn't just his breath. There was something else, something in the air. A smell. Rotten. Like decayed flesh, mixed with something burning. Her vision blurred. She blinked, trying to focus, but everything was spinning. And then, in the corner of her eye, something moved again. A shadow. Bigger this time. It shifted, slithering along the walls. It was coming closer. Her body screamed, but her mind was frozen in terror. The man's lips parted, revealing teeth, sharp, yellow, jagged. He leaned in closer. His breath on her skin was hot, putrid. Run. The word came out as a rasp. Run. But where? She couldn't move. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. A sharp, sickening sound. The figure behind the man? It was here now. Mira didn't see it, didn't need to. She could feel it. Something wet and cold slid along her neck. A whisper of breath against her ear. Too late. Everything went black. The blackness swallowed her whole. No light. No sound. Just a cold, suffocating void. Myra's body felt numb. But her mind was still screaming. She tried to move, but nothing responded. Her heart raced, each beat deafening in the silence. Then, slowly, a flicker of awareness returned. Her body was lying on something cold, hard. Stone. She tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids felt heavy, like they were sealed shut. Panic surged. A groan escaped her lips as she strained to lift her hand. It felt wrong. Her fingers tingled with a sharp, electrical sensation. Her hand brushed against something smooth, slippery. A wet surface. Her breath quickened, ragged. Where was she? What was happening? The darkness began to shift, the air around her thickening with a pulse of heat. She could feel it, something moving in the dark. Not far. Not far at all. A sound, a low growl, almost human, almost animal. Her pulse quickened. Then she heard the whisper again. The voice was closer this time, but still faint. Wake up. Myra's eyes snapped open. The world came into focus in an instant. The alley was gone. Instead, she was lying in a cavern, dimly lit by flickering torchlight. The walls were rough stone, jagged, like the inside of a tomb. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her chest. Her body was bruised, battered. Her clothes were torn. Her head spun as she gazed around, heart racing. Was this where they took her? The whispers grew louder now. No longer just one voice, but many. They all seemed to be saying the same thing. Wake up. Wake up. Mira struggled to her knees, ignoring the pain, the dizziness. She was in a dark chamber, deep underground, a labyrinth of tunnels. She wasn't alone. The figures moved at the edges of her vision. Shapes, shadows, watching, waiting. Then she saw them, emerging from the darkness. Tall, thin, clad in robes as tattered as the man's. Their faces were hidden, but their eyes glowing like burning embers. Myra's breath hitched. Who? What are you? Her voice cracked, desperate. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. One of them stepped forward, and in its hand, a gleaming dagger. The dagger glinted in the dim light, its edge sharp and glistening with an ominous sheen. Myra's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled at her sides, fingers brushing the cold stone beneath her. She wanted to run, but her body refused to move. The figure raised the dagger slowly, its eyes never leaving hers. There was something about the way it moved, so deliberate, so precise. It didn't feel real, like this moment was stretching, warping time itself. The silence between them thickened, pressing in on her chest. A cold sweat slicked her skin. Her heartbeat was the only thing she could hear now, pounding, erratic. The figure stopped, just inches away, the blade hovering above her. Mira tried to steady her breath, to speak, but her voice failed her. The air grew heavier, thicker. Something shifted behind her. The sound of soft, slithering steps echoed through the chamber. A cold, metallic scent filled her nostrils. The figure didn't move, but she could feel it watching her, waiting. And then a voice, low, gravelly, echoed from the shadows. We can't let you go. Myra's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, though she couldn't place it. It was the same one from before, the one that had whispered in her ear. She turned her head, desperately searching for the source. But the cavern remained still, the shadows stretching, waiting. The figure's eyes glowed brighter now, like embers about to burst into flame. The blade lowered. Closer, closer. Myra's body screamed for movement. She could almost feel the cold steel against her skin. Her heart thudded violently in her chest. And then, without warning, she did move. A rush of adrenaline shot through her veins. She pushed herself up from the cold stone, stumbling to her feet. The figure didn't hesitate. It lunged, its hand outstretched, fingers like claws. But Mira was faster. She twisted, ducking beneath its outstretched arm. A sharp breath tore from her lips as she darted toward the darkness ahead, running blindly. Behind her, the figure's footsteps followed. Faster now, closer. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the narrow passage, her feet slipping on the wet stone. She turned a corner, but the tunnel only seemed to stretch longer, twisting impossibly. The sound of pursuit was growing louder, closer. The shadows seemed to close in on her from all sides. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out. But then, ahead, she saw something, an opening, a sliver of light. Hope surged through her chest. She pushed harder, faster. The light grew brighter, but as she neared it, something cold and sharp wrapped around her ankle. She screamed. Her body was jerked backward, pulling her to the ground. Her hand scraped against the stone as she tried to pull herself free. And then, as the shadows closed in on her, the voice returned, this time right behind her ear. "You can't escape." The darkness swallowed her. Once more, the cold, clammy grip around her ankle tightened. Her body jerked back violently, dragging her into the blackness. She clawed at the stone beneath her, fingertips scraping, but it was no use. Someone was pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her breath came in frantic gasps, but her chest felt like it was being crushed. The shadows closed in tighter, thickening like smoke. She reached for anything to break free, but there was nothing, just the cold, the dark, the suffocating silence. The voice was there again, as close as the breath in her ear. "You should have never come here." Her skin prickled, her heart racing faster than she thought possible. The more she fought, the tighter the grip became. The shadows seemed to move, coiling around her legs like serpents, dragging her down into the earth. With one final, desperate effort, Mira kicked her legs, her body twisting against the pull. The sound of bones cracking beneath the pressure echoed in the cavern. She screamed, and then silence. The pull stopped. The grip was gone. Mira lay still on the cold ground, gasping for air, her chest heaving as if it were a struggle to breathe. She dared not move, not yet, terrified that the shadows would come back, that the grip would return. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own breath, ragged and desperate. Then, something shifted in the air. A whisper, a laugh, low and dark. Myra's eyes darted around, but the darkness remained thick, oppressive, like a blanket suffocating her. But this time, there was something else. A faint flicker of light, a lantern, swinging gently, casting long, trembling shadows. It was coming closer. Myra's heart slammed in her chest as she turned toward the light, trying to sit up, to move, but her body was weak. The lantern's glow revealed the figure standing just ahead. Another shadow. But this one was different. This figure was tall, its form cloaked in darkness. Its face was hidden, but Mira could feel its eyes on her. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, cracked. The figure stepped forward, its footfalls silent on the stone. "Why?" Mira whispered, her voice barely a breath. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out slowly, its hand moving through the air like it was drawing the very darkness toward it. And then, with one swift motion, it lifted something small and glistening. A key. It glowed faintly, like it had been pulled from the heart of the shadows. Mira stared at it, her mind racing. What was it for? And then, the voice spoke again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. "You can't escape. Not until you've unlocked it." The figure extended the key toward her, but Myra's hand didn't move to take it. She was too afraid to. The shadows were still watching, still waiting, and the key, whatever it was, held all the answers. But were the answers worth the cost? Mira stared at the key, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The shadows shifted, twisting around the figure, as though they were waiting for her to make a choice. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The figure stood motionless, holding the key out like an offering, yet something in the air told her it wasn't a gift. It was a sentence. The lantern flickered again, casting long shadows that stretched far beyond her sight. The voice, distant but clear, whispered once more, "Unlock it, and everything will be revealed." Her eyes flicked to the key, its faint glow almost hypnotic, like it was calling to her. Unlock what? What would happen if she took it? The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble as though the very earth was alive, reacting to her hesitation. Myra's hand twitched. The fear in her chest was suffocating, but curiosity gnawed at her too. What could this key unlock? She didn't know, but she couldn't stay here forever. The shadows were closing in again. Her breath hitched in her throat. The figure stepped closer, its presence heavy, oppressive. Myra's body trembled, but she slowly, cautiously, lifted her hand toward the key. Just as her fingers brushed against the cool metal, the world around her seemed to shudder. A low rumble shook the walls of the cavern, vibrating through her bones. The figure didn't move, didn't react. But something in the air had changed, something ancient and malevolent. The lantern's light dimmed, casting the entire chamber in a deeper, more oppressive dark. And then there was a sound, a distant scream, faint but unmistakable. Mira froze. It wasn't her own. The scream echoed, stretching through the darkness, bouncing off the stone walls. It sounded like something was trapped in the very same hell she had fallen into. Her hand hovered over the key for a long moment, the air thick with tension. The scream echoed again, louder this time, closer. The darkness seemed to pulse with it. She couldn't wait any longer. With a shaking breath, Mira closed her fingers around the key. The moment she touched it, the cavern erupted in noise, a deafening, bone-shaking crash, like thunder breaking the earth. The shadows screamed, the darkness twisting violently around her. The lantern flickered wildly, its light dimming to near nothingness. And then the ground beneath her feet gave way. Mira fell, falling, tumbling into the void. She couldn't scream. She couldn't breathe. The fall was endless, a rush of air that tore at her skin, her clothes. And then she hit the ground, hard. The world spun, her vision blurred, and then silence. The darkness was gone. The shadows had receded, but a cold, empty feeling filled her chest. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the harsh light that suddenly surrounded her. She wasn't in the cavern anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere worse. The figure was gone, but something else was there now. Something waiting. Mira struggled to sit up, her body sore, her head spinning. The ground beneath her was different, smooth, almost polished. She pushed herself up, glancing around with wide eyes. She wasn't in the cavern anymore. No, this place was worse. The air was cold, but not the kind of cold she had felt before. This was unnatural. A chilling stillness that seemed to wrap itself around her like an invisible shroud. Her gaze shifted. The walls surrounding her were made of black stone, smooth and seamless, stretching far beyond her sight. There were no doors, no windows, nothing but the thick, suffocating darkness at the edges of the stone. And then she heard it, a faint whisper. It was barely audible, but it was there, low, creeping. At first, she couldn't make out the words, but then it became clearer. Welcome. Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't distant this time. It was right in front of her. She jerked her head up, scanning the room, her breath quickening. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the cold, endless darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, but this time it was sharper. Closer. "You are where you belong." Myra's skin prickled. The voice, something about it, something familiar but wrong. Her pulse quickened as the words echoed in her mind. Where she belonged. What did that mean? Her heart pounded as she pushed herself to her feet, panic seizing her chest. The whispers seemed to come from all directions now, their volume growing. They were speaking in unison. 1,000 voices, layered on top of one another, all chanting the same thing. You cannot leave. You are ours now. Mira staggered backward, her eyes darting around in a frantic search for an exit that didn't exist. No doors, no windows, no way out. Her hands trembled as she felt the smooth stone walls around her. She ran her fingers over the cold surface, hoping, praying, for something to change. But the whispers only grew louder. You cannot leave, not until it's done. The words reverberated in her mind, twisting and distorting everything around her. The air grew heavier with every breath. Her heart raced faster. Her thoughts were scattered. Not until what's done, she shouted, desperate. What do you want from me? The darkness seemed to respond, growing colder. Her breath came in visible bursts, but the air around her felt thick, suffocating. And then something moved, a shape, a figure, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in darkness. But unlike the others, this one seemed different. It wasn't just the same shadow. No, this one had a presence, a power. It stepped closer, its silhouette barely visible against the black stone, but the weight of its existence was undeniable. Myra's breath hitched as she took a step back. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its eyes, glowing red, locked onto hers. And in that instant, she knew. There was no escape. The whispers ceased. A terrible silence filled the space. Then, the figure raised its hand, and Mira felt something sharp, a searing pain, shoot through her chest. She gasped, her body convulsing, but she couldn't move. The figure was in her mind now, in her thoughts. You will become one of us. The darkness surged forward, consuming her. And this time, there was no scream, no hope, only the endless abyss. Pulling her deeper, the pain in her chest intensified, a sharp, burning sensation that spread through her veins like fire. Mira tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body trembled, her limbs numb, frozen in place. The figure's red eyes burned into her soul, its presence overwhelming. She could feel it pulling at her mind, at her very essence, like it was tearing her apart from the inside. You belong to the darkness now, the figure's voice whispered, cold and venomous. Each word felt like it was being etched into her very soul, carving her identity away, piece by piece. Her vision blurred, her head spinning. She felt herself slipping away from who she was, losing herself to something darker. The shadows around her began to shift, to writhe, as if they were alive. They twisted in strange, unnatural patterns, swirling in the air like smoke, drawing closer. She could hear them now, voices low and guttural, murmuring from all sides. Her mind screamed in desperation, but it felt like her thoughts were being swallowed whole by the darkness. The cold pressure in her chest tightened, suffocating her. Suddenly, a flash of light, bright, blinding, flashed before her eyes. She gasped, her vision clearing for just a moment. For a split second, she saw someone, a figure standing at the edge of the shadows, a silhouette, distant and faint, but unmistakable. It was a man she recognized. Her heart skipped. It was the same man, the one she had seen earlier in the alley, the one who had led her to this nightmare. His face was no longer hidden beneath a hood, and now she could see the truth. His face was pale, almost deathly, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He stepped forward into the light, and his lips curled into a cruel, knowing smile. "You're too late," he said softly. His voice was calm, almost detached, but there was an unmistakable satisfaction in his tone. Myra's breath caught in her throat. "You brought me here," she whispered, barely able to speak through the overwhelming darkness. The man nodded slowly, his smile widening. "I didn't bring you here," he said. "You brought yourself." The world around her, began to distort again, the shadows writhing and pulling at her limbs, dragging her deeper into the abyss. The figure with the glowing red eyes stepped forward again, its cold hand reaching out toward her. Myra's body went limp, unable to resist. The air around her felt like a vice, tightening until she could barely breathe. "You will become one with us," the voice echoed, hollow and empty. But the man's voice cut through the darkness, loud and sharp. "Not yet." Suddenly, the shadows faltered, their movements stilled by the command. The man's eyes locked with hers again, this time softer, filled with something that almost seemed like regret. "You're not ready," he said quietly, "but soon you will be." A flicker of light appeared, faint but growing stronger with each passing second. The man turned his gaze toward it, a shadow of sadness crossing his features. Then, in a moment that felt like an eternity, the light expanded, enveloping them both. And the world around Mira shattered. The black stone walls crumbled into nothingness, and the shadows were gone. She was falling again. This time, there was no pain, no scream, just darkness and silence. The fall seemed endless, but without the crushing weight of fear. No sharp pain, no suffocating darkness, just the feeling of floating, suspended in a strange liminal space. Mira could no longer feel the ground beneath her, nor the cold stone pressing in from all sides. She didn't know if she was moving up or down, or if time had even passed. All that remained was an oppressive stillness, like the air itself had stopped breathing. Then, without warning, a sound pierced the silence. A single quiet thud, a shift. Her feet met something solid, soft even. She gasped, her hands instinctively reaching out to steady herself as she steadied her breath. The moment she touched the ground, the space around her seemed to come alive again, flickering like a dying candle flame. Her vision cleared. The shadows were gone. The endless abyss had been replaced by a new, unfamiliar place. Mira stood, her legs weak, but her mind racing. Before her lay a vast expanse, an open desert. Golden sands stretched far and wide, endless under a dark, starlit sky. It was both serene and wrong. The air here was thick with heat, despite the coldness that clung to her skin. Her throat felt dry, as if she hadn't breathed in fresh air for ages. A low, unearthly hum vibrated in the distance. Mira took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked up at the sky, an impossibly black, swirling canvas, dotted with distant stars. In the distance, she could see a shape emerging from the horizon. It was tall, towering. It seemed to move as though it was walking directly toward her, its massive form barely distinguishable against the dark sky. Myra's breath caught in her throat. The figure was cloaked in shadows, like something pulled from the heart of a storm. And with every step it took, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. Her pulse quickened. Was this another entity? Another creature from the depths of her nightmare? The figure's shape grew clearer with each passing moment. It was humanoid, but something about it felt wrong. Its legs were long, impossibly long, bending at odd angles. Its arms were stretched out wide, each one ending in claw-like fingers. The hum grew louder. The air grew heavier. Myra's chest tightened, her breath coming faster. What was this thing? It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but Mira could feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing against her ribs. She took a step back instinctively. Then a voice, a whisper, low and haunting, came from the figure, echoing through the vast desert. "You've come too far to turn back now." The words hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her body refused to move. The figure's eyes, glowing faintly red, locked onto hers. And then its voice again, colder, more insistent. "Do you know what you've done?" Mira couldn't answer. She didn't know anymore. The ground began to crack beneath her feet, deep fissures spreading outward, like the earth itself was breaking apart. Her heart pounded as the desert started to dissolve around her, the once endless sands shifting into something else, something dark. Shapes began to emerge from the cracks, figures, creatures, dark shapes that slithered and moved, coiling up from the abyss below. They surrounded her, pressing in from all sides. The figure loomed over her now, towering above her, its hand reaching down toward her face. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The voice from the figure came again, soft and final. "You're already ours." Myra's heart stopped in her chest as the figure's hand drew closer, each inch of its movement like a countdown to something she couldn't escape. The creatures, no, things, surrounded her, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, their shapes moving in unnatural, jerking motions as they coiled and shifted around her. Her breath hitched. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced herself to stand, her mind screaming for a way out that wasn't there. The ground beneath her cracked even more, splitting open like a wound, revealing deep chasms of blackness that seemed to reach down into eternity. The weight of the figure's gaze pressed against her. It was too much, suffocating her, stealing the air from her lungs. The hand, enormous and dark, reached out with fingers that were like talons, sharp and impossibly long. Mira flinched, stepping back, but the desert floor gave way beneath her feet, sending her stumbling toward the yawning abyss. The things around her hissed, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the desert air. She was running out of time. Her eyes locked with the figures once again, and she felt it. Asterisk felt asterisk, its presence in every part of her. It wasn't just in front of her, it was inside her, in her thoughts, in her soul. "You've opened the door," the voice said again, softer now, but colder, like it was a truth she couldn't deny. And once a door like this is opened, it can never be closed. She tried to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The earth beneath her seemed to fold and twist, pulling her deeper, sucking her into its very core. And just as she thought she was about to be consumed, the figure moved. It didn't rush. It didn't hurry. Its hand reached out slowly, almost with care, and touched her forehead. The moment it made contact, a jolt shot through her, a violent flash of cold that filled her every nerve. The shadows, the creatures, they all seemed to merge in that instant, becoming one swirling mass of darkness that pressed against her, crawling beneath her skin, suffocating her. Mira gasped, a shock of realization hitting her all at once. She knew what this was. This wasn't just an escape from the nightmare. This was part of it. Her thoughts began to fragment, breaking into pieces that scattered like sand, slipping away faster than she could grasp. The figure's grip tightened, and a horrifying clarity washed over her. She wasn't supposed to leave. She never had been. "You belong here," the voice rasped in her ear. The very ground beneath her seemed to pulse with the voice's words, sending waves of darkness through her limbs, filling her body, drowning her in something ancient and cold. But then, a flash of something, a brief sliver of light, cut through the suffocating blackness. A feeling, a memory, something from before, a voice, a whisper, "Wake up." The voice was familiar, but it wasn't the one she had heard before. It wasn't the figure. Mira felt a surge of strength, like the last flicker of light in her soul, fighting against the overwhelming darkness. She fought to move, to remember, but the figure's grip was too strong. The creatures hissed louder, their eyes narrowing, almost waiting. But Mira didn't stop. With a final, desperate push, she yanked herself free from the grasp of the figure. She couldn't look back. The darkness tried to pull her under, but she was stronger now, her mind fighting against the weight of it all. In that moment, she felt something give way. The world around her fractured, splintering like glass, and she was falling again. But this time, She wasn't falling into the abyss. She was falling out. Everything around her shattered into pieces, the darkness receding, and just before it all vanished, a voice. One final whisper. Not yet. And then, silenced, Myra's body jerked awake, her chest heaving, her mind still racing through the remnants of the nightmare. Her eyes shot open, and for a brief, disorienting moment, she couldn't tell where she was. The darkness was still thick in her mind, clouding her thoughts. She was lying on cold, hard stone, no desert, no twisted creatures, just a dimly lit room with walls that seemed to close in on her. Her breath came in frantic bursts, the remnants of that suffocating presence still clinging to her. She shot to her feet, heart hammering against her ribs, as she took in the surroundings. It was a small, stone-walled chamber, the air thick with the scent of dampness and decay. There were no windows, no doors, nothing but the oppressive silence. The light came from a single, flickering candle on the floor. Its weak flame cast long, trembling shadows across the walls. Mira could still hear the echoes of the voice. Asterisk, not yet asterisk. A chill ran down her spine. It couldn't be over. Not like this. Her eyes scanned the room, her pulse still racing. She needed to find an exit. She had to escape. But no matter how hard she searched, there was nothing. No way out. Her fingers brushed against the stone wall as she paced, panic rising in her chest. The room felt alive, the walls pressing in closer, as if they were watching her, waiting for her next move. A soft sound broke through the silence, a whisper. Her body froze. It was coming from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But the room was empty. She strained her ears, and the whisper came again, barely audible. You're not alone. Myra's breath caught. The air around her felt colder now, more oppressive. She stepped toward the flickering candle, but before she could reach it, the ground beneath her shook. The stone trembled, and a low growl rumbled through the floor. The candle's flame flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and writhe, as though the darkness itself was alive, crawling toward her. Her heart raced, and before she could react, the shadows around the room twisted. A form began to emerge, a shape, just like the figure from the desert, but now it was different, larger, angrier. It was all shadows, a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to grow and shrink in impossible ways. Myra's legs locked in place, her body refusing to move, but her mind screamed. You can never escape, the figure hissed, its voice deeper, more guttural now. This is where you belong. She stumbled backward, her hands pressing against the stone wall, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch further, crawling over the walls, the ceiling, wrapping around her like an invisible rope. The air grew thick. The whispering voices grew louder, all speaking at once, words blending into a chaotic chorus of not yet, not yet, not yet. The figure stepped forward, its glowing eyes burning through the shifting mass of darkness. You opened the door, Mira, it said, its voice resonating through her chest, vibrating her very bones. And now, there's no turning back. Her pulse pounded in her ears, each beat a reminder of how trapped she was. And then, just as before, a flicker of light, another whisper, like a breath in the darkness. This time, it wasn't the figure's voice. It was something familiar. Wake up. Myra's heart skipped. She knew that voice. The shadows screamed, recoiling from the light that suddenly burst to life, spilling out from the corner of the room. With a gasp, Mira staggered back as the darkness retreated, folding in on itself, disappearing into the corners of the room. The figure howled, its form faltering for a moment before it began to shrink and distort, fading into the darkness with the other creatures that had once surrounded her. The light intensified, blinding her for a moment. And then, as the world around her shattered again, everything went still. The room, the shadows, the chaos. It was all gone. Mira opened her eyes again, but this time she was no longer in the stone chamber, no longer in the desert. She was somewhere else, somewhere real. Mira blinked, her surroundings still hazy, as she tried to make sense of the sudden shift. The air felt different, fresher, warmer. There was a hum of life all around her, something she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. She pushed herself up, her body weak, but no longer heavy with the suffocating weight of the shadows. Her fingers brushed against soft fabric, asterisk cloth, asterisk. She looked down, realizing she was no longer in the rags she had been wearing in that cursed chamber. She was dressed in simple, loose clothing, clothes that felt real, tangible, like they belonged to the world she had once known. Her heart thudded as she looked around. The world she was now in felt completely different from the nightmare realm. The stone walls, the darkness, the unrelenting pressure, they were gone. She was outside, a bustling market. Mira blinked again, disbelief clawing at her chest. She could smell spices in the air, the chatter of people all around her, the sound of footsteps in the dirt. Vibrant colors swirled before her eyes as vendors called out their wares. The sun beat down from a clear blue sky, bathing everything in golden light. She stumbled forward, her legs shaky. She couldn't believe it. Was it real? Was she truly awake? But as she moved deeper into the market, her heart sank. Something felt off. The people around her were moving too quickly, too purposefully. Their eyes were dull, their faces emotionless. And the more she looked, the more she realized something was wrong. The buildings were crooked, leaning at impossible angles, their windows dark and empty. The ground beneath her feet was cracked in places, as if the earth itself was scarred, fractured. The distant noise of the market began to fade, drowned out by a soft ringing in her ears. It was happening again. She could feel it, the pressure, the heaviness, slowly creeping back. Her vision began to blur once more, the edges of everything around her starting to distort, like the world itself was twisting and bending. Mira gasped, backing away from the crowd, her breath quickening. No, she whispered to herself. No, not again. But the voices returned, low, whispers at first, then growing louder. Asterisk, you cannot escape. Asterisk, asterisk, not yet. Asterisk, asterisk, you belong to us. Asterisk. The ground beneath her trembled once more. The shadows from before were creeping back, slithering along the cracks in the dirt, stretching toward her. Her chest tightened, and she could feel the familiar cold, the suffocating darkness. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside her head, filling every corner of her mind. The figure's voice came through the chaos, a chilling whisper. You thought you could escape, but the door you opened can never be closed. Myra's vision flickered between the market and the endless void she had left behind. The two worlds collided, merging, overlapping in a chaotic spiral. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The pressure was unbearable. And then, through the fog, she saw it. A dark figure standing at the edge of the market, watching her, unmoving. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, its eyes glowing red. The very same figure, the same one that had followed her from the desert, from the stone chamber. Myra's heart lurched as the reality of her situation hit her. She wasn't free. She was still trapped. She had never truly escaped. The figure took one step forward, and the world around her seemed to freeze. Asterisk, you will never escape. Asterisk, it whispered, its voice now a roar inside her skull. The ground cracked beneath her feet, and the darkness surged forward. Mira screamed. The scream was torn from her throat, raw and desperate. But the sound seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the growing darkness. The figure's glowing red eyes fixed on her, unblinking, unyielding. Every part of her wanted to run, to escape, but her legs felt like lead. The shadow beneath her feet was growing, spreading, swallowing the ground. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices, closing in from every direction. Not yet, not yet. Mira staggered backward, her chest tight, her breath shallow, as the figure moved again, its massive form creeping forward, impossibly slow but relentless. "You belong to us," it said, its voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "You will never escape." Her mind screamed in protest. She had to get away, had to find a way to break free. But the ground beneath her cracked again. The earth split, yawning open into a deep chasm, and from that dark abyss, shadows began to crawl upward, twisting and curling like serpents, slithering toward her. The figure's silhouette loomed ever closer. Everything around her was breaking apart. The market, the sky, the ground. It was all splintering, fracturing into pieces like a shattered mirror. The world was disintegrating, slipping back into the nightmare. No, no. Mira gasped, her throat dry, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her head, trying to block out the suffocating noise. The shadows reached for her, cold fingers brushing against her skin, dragging her back toward the edge of the chasm. She fought against them, kicking, clawing, but they were everywhere now, surrounding her, pulling at her, tugging her deeper into the void. The figure's voice came again, louder this time, a thunderous command. "You can never outrun what you are. You open the door, and now you will remain here." Myra's body jerked as the shadows seized her, their grip unyielding. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her body felt like it was being torn apart, stretched into nothing. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard it. Another voice, distant but growing clearer. "Mira?" She gasped, blinking rapidly. The voice wasn't from the figure. It was something familiar. The shadows around her faltered, their grip loosening, just for a moment. Asterisk wake up, asterisk. The voice was softer now, more insistent. It was him, the man, the one she had seen before, the one who had seemed to help her, if only for a moment. Her head spun. Was she still dreaming? Was this another trap? But the figure, asterisk the thing asterisk, paused, its eyes narrowing, its form flickering, like it was unsure of something. The man's voice came again, louder, clearer this time. "Mira, wake up." The shadows writhed around her, but they hesitated now. Something had shifted. Something inside her was changing. With a final, frantic surge of energy, Mira shoved against the darkness, her hands reaching for the light, for the voice. A sharp pain flared in her chest. Her head spun, but she didn't stop. Her fingers brushed something warm, something solid, and in that moment, everything seemed to crack wide open. The world around her shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces, and then silence. Mira opened her eyes. Her body was weightless. The oppressive, suffocating feeling was gone. She was no longer in the desert, no longer in that chamber, no longer trapped. She could feel the warmth of sunlight against her skin. Slowly, cautiously, she sat up. Her surroundings were peaceful now, quiet. She was in a small room, sunlight filtering through a window, casting soft light across a modest bed and simple wooden furniture. This time, there were no shadows, no whispers, just the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees outside. Her heart raced, but it was different now. There was no coldness, no weight pressing down on her. She was free, but before she could take another breath, she felt it again. The cold, not in the room, but deep inside her. The same eerie sensation she had felt in that dark world. The same pull, the same haunting whisper. And then, Like a distant memory pressing at the edges of her mind, she heard it once more. Not yet. Myra's heart stopped. She wasn't free after all. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. Myra's breath caught in her throat as a chill spread across her skin, the sensation creeping down her spine. She didn't dare move. Her heart pounded louder than the wind outside. The whisper, asterisk, not yet, asterisk, rang in her ears again. Not a mere echo, but a presence, a shadow that lingered just out of sight. She could feel it, like an invisible weight pressing against her chest. Her fingers gripped the edge of the bed, the wood cold beneath her touch. She felt trapped in her own body, a prisoner in a place that should have been safe. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught her eye. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, slithering like ink spreading across water. Her eyes darted toward the window, but outside, the sun still shone brightly. There was no sign of anything out of place, but the presence was growing stronger. The room began to distort, the walls shifting ever so slightly, warping at the edges of her vision. Myra's pulse raced. She stood up shakily, her legs unsteady beneath her as she backed away from the bed, her breath quickening. Asterisk, no, asterisk, she whispered to herself, clenching her fists. It's not real. It can't be. But even as she spoke the words, she could feel it. Asterisk, the pull asterisk, that cold, familiar sensation from the darkness, seeping into the room, into her bones. Her eyes locked onto the door. It was ajar, just slightly, a small crack, but enough to make her stomach twist. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it was standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. You are still ours. The sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, echoed down the hallway outside the room, reverberating through the walls. The air thickened with each passing moment. Mira froze, her body refusing to move as the sound grew closer. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. The door creaked open just a little more, inch by agonizing inch. Myra's eyes darted to the corner of the room. A shadow, tall, dark, and unmistakably familiar, stood there, its red eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The figure. It stepped into the room with a sound like rustling fabric, slow and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat as it moved closer, the shadows surrounding it like a cloak. It was tall, too tall, and its form wavered in and out of focus, a grotesque distortion of everything around it. You thought you could escape, the figure hissed, its voice cold and taunting. You cannot outrun what you are. Mira backed away, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel the tears welling in her eyes, but she couldn't look away. She couldn't move. You belong to the darkness, the figure whispered, its voice echoing in her mind, filling every corner of her thoughts. You always have. Her heart slammed against her chest. The room was closing in, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows growing longer, deeper. Myra's body was shaking uncontrollably. Asterisk, not again. Please, not again, asterisk. But then, just as she thought she might be swallowed whole by the darkness, the figure stopped. It seemed to hesitate for a moment. Then it tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing as if studying her. For the first time since it had appeared, there was something different about it. A flicker of something, not pity, but a spark of something almost human. You're not ready, it murmured, its voice softer now, but still chilling. But soon you will be. And with that, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the shadows with a suddenness that left Mira gasping for air. The room fell silent again. The oppressive weight lifted and the air grew thin. The shadows began to recede, pulling back into the corners, fading as if they had never been there. But the presence, the coldness, lingered. Myra's breath was shallow, her mind spinning with the uncertainty of what had just happened. She wasn't sure whether she had imagined it or not, but the room felt different now. There was no more whispering, no more footsteps, no more shadows stretching out to claim her. For a moment, everything felt still. Then, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash. Mira spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. She reached for the door, her hands trembling, but as she gripped the knob, she felt it, another presence behind her, rising from the floor beneath her feet. The walls of the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the very space itself was alive. She whipped around to face whatever waited in the dark, but there was nothing. Nothing but the suffocating silence. And then, asterisk a voice asterisk. The familiar whisper. But this time it wasn't behind her. It was inside her mind. Not yet. The whisper seemed to vibrate in her skull, filling every inch of her brain with its chilling presence. Not yet. Mira froze, every muscle in her body locking with the weight of the words. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, suffocating her, pressing her down into the stone floor beneath her feet. Her pulse raced, but no matter how fast her heart beat, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into something beyond her control. Her hands trembled as she reached out toward the door again, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the doorknob. But it didn't turn. It wouldn't budge. The room around her began to pulse, its corners darkening as the shadows grew thicker. The very walls seemed to breathe slowly, rhythmically, like the entire room was alive. She stepped back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no exit, no escape, not yet. The voice came again, this time clearer, more insistent, as though the darkness itself was speaking directly into her mind. Her head was spinning, her thoughts tangled in a web of confusion. She tried to think, to piece together what was happening, but the more she tried, the less sense it made. Her skin tingled, her senses on high alert, but there was no sound, no warning, nothing. And then, asterisk a crack, asterisk, a sharp, deafening sound, like the breaking of glass. Mira turned toward the noise, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the air, thick and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was pressing against her, trying to crush her. And then something moved. It was subtle at first, a small shift, like a ripple across the floor. But then it became more pronounced, growing louder, more solid. The shadows at the edge of the room stirred. The floor cracked again, and this time it wasn't just a sound. The ground beneath her feet shifted, the stone buckling like it was being warped by some invisible force. Mira gasped, stepping backward, her heart racing as she tried to steady herself. The room was moving, bending, warping in ways that didn't make sense. And then, from the corner of her vision, she saw it. A figure, a shadow, tall and unmistakable, standing in the doorway. It was him again. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing faintly, piercing through the shadows. "Do you really think you can escape?" the figure hissed, its voice no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural growl. Asterisk, you will never leave, asterisk. Myra's breath hitched as she backed away, but no matter how far she moved, the figure only seemed to draw closer. It was as if it was pulling her in, like gravity itself had changed, bending toward the figure's presence. Her chest tightened with panic. She had to move. She had to do something. But then, the figure spoke again, its voice thick with malice. "You open the door, Mira," it said, its tone dark and final. "Now you belong to it. To us." Myra's legs felt weak beneath her. She could barely stand. She could feel the ground beneath her beginning to crack again, the darkness swirling like a storm inside the room, closing in from all directions. She was trapped. She was always going to be trapped, no matter what she did, No, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. I won't. But the figure stepped forward, its massive form looming over her, its shadow swallowing the light. It reached toward her, its fingers elongated, claw-like, as if it could touch her soul itself. Mira tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure's hand closed in, its fingers brushing her face with an icy touch, sending a shockwave of cold through her veins. And then, just as it seemed everything would collapse, the world around her shuddered. The ground shook, and the shadows writhed. Everything broke. The room, the walls, the very air around her, splintered like glass, crashing into jagged shards. The figure's grip loosened, its form faltering, flickering like a broken image on a fading screen. Myra's mind raced as the chaos surged around her, the overwhelming pressure of it all becoming unbearable. And then, as quickly as it had come, it stopped. The figure, the shadows, the crushing pressure, everything vanished. For a long, dizzying moment, Mira was left standing in the middle of nothing. She was weightless, her heart beat painfully in her chest as the silence enveloped her. The air was thick with an eerie calm, but it wasn't peaceful. It was wrong. The coldness returned, seeping into her very core. And once again, she heard it. The whisper, *not yet, *. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The whisper lingered in her mind, a low hum that vibrated through every fiber of her being. *not yet, *. Myra's body trembled with the weight of it. She could feel it, crawling beneath her skin, sinking deep into her bones. The shadows, the darkness, weren't gone. They were just waiting, biding their time, lurking just beneath the surface. Her chest tightened as the air around her grew thick again, dense and suffocating. The space she was in, this nothingness, felt more oppressive than any room she had been trapped in before. There was no sound, no light, no escape. Her fingers clenched at her sides, nails digging into the palms of her hands. She was paralyzed, stuck in a place between worlds, between realities. And then it came, the shift. The floor beneath her feet cracked open again, this time louder than ever. The black void below seemed to pull at her, beckoning her down. She could feel the pull, the force, grabbing at her, dragging her closer, threatening to swallow her whole. Her breath came in frantic gasps. She tried to move, tried to step away, but the air was too thick, too heavy. Her limbs felt like they were made of stone, slow and unresponsive. The whisper came again, closer this time, inside her head, inside her very soul. You belong to us. The words cut deep, sinking into her like a blade. She felt them, every syllable, carving into her thoughts, into her very identity. No, she gasped, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. No, I won't. But before she could finish, the shadows around her shifted, moving with purpose, growing, crawling toward her from all sides. She could feel them now, the coldness of their touch, like ice against her skin. Her eyes snapped open. There was no escape. The darkness surrounded her, closing in from every direction, the world narrowing into a tiny pinprick of light. And then, a sound, a sharp crack, followed by the deep, guttural rumble of something, something massive, stirring within the darkness. Myra's pulse raced. She turned in every direction, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the shadows were everywhere, thick and dense, suffocating her vision. The rumbling grew louder, vibrating through her bones. The ground beneath her feet trembled violently, and for a moment she thought she might be torn apart. Then, something moved, From the darkness emerged a figure, familiar and tall, its form looming as it stepped forward. It was the same figure, Asterisk, the one that haunted her dreams, that had hunted her through the desert, the stone chamber, and now here asterisk. Its glowing eyes pierced through the shadows, locking onto hers. "You can never escape," it growled, its voice low and guttural, echoing in her mind like a funeral dirge. "You open the door. You will never close it. Not now. Not ever." Myra's heart thundered in her chest, the weight of its words crushing her. She tried to scream, to fight, but the shadows were closing in again, wrapping themselves around her limbs, holding her still. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, like a wave crashing over her, drowning her in its darkness. "You belong to us, Mira," it said again, its voice almost tender, like a cruel lullaby. "You always have." Myra's vision blurred, the edges of the world fraying like tattered fabric. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment she thought she might lose herself to the darkness. She could feel the pull, the weight of the shadows wrapping tighter around her, sinking into her very soul. No, not again, she thought, her body shaking. And then, through the haze of her fear, something shifted. A light. Weak, flickering at first, but it grew, a tiny spark against the consuming darkness. The shadows recoiled, snapping back, like they feared the light. The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing in confusion. It seemed vulnerable for a moment, uncertain. Myra's breath caught. She had no idea where the light had come from, but she knew. Asterisk, this was her chance, asterisk. With everything she had left, she focused on the light. The warmth, the brightness. Asterisk, it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality, asterisk. She reached out toward it, desperate, her fingers trembling. And for the first time, she felt something shift. The light burned brighter, a blinding flare that split through the darkness, like a sword through night. The figure screamed, a horrible, tortured sound, as the light consumed it, burning away the shadows in an instant. Myra's body jerked back as the light surrounded her, its warmth engulfing her, pushing the darkness away. She could feel the coldness, the pressure, everything that had been holding her. Asterisk, dissolve, asterisk. For a brief moment, there was silence. Complete, utter silence. Then, as the light faded, Mira opened her eyes. The darkness was gone. She was no longer trapped. She stood in the same room, but now it was bathed in warm, golden light. The walls were solid, the air was clean, the shadows had vanished. Myra's heart slowed, her breathing still erratic. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she could feel the pull of reality, the weight of the world returning. She was awake, she was free, but the question lingered. For how long? Mira stood there, her body trembling as the weight of the moment settled in. The room around her, once suffocating and distorted, was now bathed in the warmth of daylight. The air felt real again, clean, solid, grounding. The darkness had receded. The figure was gone. The pressure, the crushing cold, all gone. But even as she looked around, feeling the pulse of life return to her body, the unease remained. It was too quiet. Her gaze flickered to the window, the sunlight streaming through it, casting golden patterns on the wooden floor. She could hear the faint sound of birds in the distance, the rustling of leaves outside. Life continued outside, but her mind refused to let go of the cold, the darkness. Her breath still came in shallow bursts, her chest tight, as if the weight of her escape had yet to fully release its grip on her. How long would it last? The thought burned through her mind like a sharp, jagged blade. She didn't know. She couldn't know. Mira closed her eyes for a moment, grounding herself, trying to push the dread aside. She was free. She had to be. But then the air shifted again, subtle this time, a shift she almost didn't catch. It was a brief sensation, but it made her skin prickle, her heart jump to her throat. And then came the sound, a faint whisper at first, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. Not yet. The words crawled up her spine, a sickeningly familiar presence that made her stomach churn. Her eyes shot open, her pulse spiking again. The room was the same, asterisk real, asterisk solid, bathed in light. But the coldness was back. She backed up toward the door, her breath quickening. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It couldn't be. She had fought so hard, pushed so far to get out of that suffocating darkness, and now it was creeping back, like a shadow in her mind, worming its way into her very thoughts. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed the doorknob. She could feel it, the tug of the darkness pulling at her once more. She wanted to escape, to run, but she couldn't. The door refused to open. Mira let out a shaky breath, pressing her hand to the door, willing it to turn, to break free of the invisible force holding it shut. And then, asterisk it happened, asterisk. A crack, a sound like glass shattering. The air seemed to fracture, splitting in two. Her chest tightened as the room warped again, the walls bending and twisting as though the world itself was unraveling. No, 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 Mira whispered to herself, panicking. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning too fast to catch. And then, asterisk a shape, asterisk. It was small at first, just a dark blur against the golden light. But it grew, stretched, expanded, until it was looming over her. The figure. It stood just at the edge of her vision, like an unfinished sketch, its outline flickering in and out, shifting between worlds. Mira stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in her throat, trapped by the overwhelming weight of fear. The shadows pulled tighter, creeping along the floor, twisting around her like they were alive, waiting for her to slip. You can never outrun what you are. The voice rumbled through the air, dark and guttural. The figure reached toward her, its hands impossibly long, fingers curling like claws, the tips glowing faintly in the dim light. No, the word formed in her mind, but she couldn't say it. She couldn't move. You thought you were free, it whispered, its voice cold and final. But you will never be free. Not now. Not ever. Myra's pulse spiked. Her mind was spiraling. She had fought so hard. She had escaped once. Why wasn't she free? The figure stepped closer, its form flickering, a dark presence that swallowed the air around her. I will always find you, Mira, it said, the words sliding through her like ice. You open the door. Now, the door will open again, and again, until there is nothing left of you. Her chest felt tight, suffocating under the weight of its words. It wasn't over. No, it would never be over. The room seemed to collapse around her, the walls drawing in, the light flickering as the darkness reached for her once more. She wasn't free. Not now. Not ever. And in that moment, Mira understood. There was no escaping it. There was no running. No matter where she went, no matter how hard she fought. The door was open, and it would always be open. Myra's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as she backed further into the room. The walls seemed to press in, squeezing the life from her chest as the figure's shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for her. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. The light around her flickered, dimming with every breath, every pulse of fear that shot through her. The figure's presence was suffocating. The darkness felt alive now, crawling over her skin, digging into her veins. You thought you could escape, it growled. But the door is always open, and you will always be ours. Myra's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, her hands trembling as they scraped against the floor, trying to find some purchase. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The coldness, the crushing pressure, it was all coming back. She closed her eyes, her mind spiraling into chaos, her pulse thudding in her ears. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She had fought. She had won. But it didn't matter. The darkness had already taken root. She could feel it, settling deep within her, like a parasite, feeding on her fear, her doubt. A shadow moved toward her, slow and deliberate, its eyes glowing faintly, its fingers reaching out, ready to claim her. "You opened the door, Mira," it said, its voice now a rasping whisper. "And now it will never close." She was suffocating. Her body felt heavy, crushed beneath the weight of its words. There was no escape, no way out. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a small flicker of defiance sparked to life. She wasn't done. She couldn't be. Her hand shot out, fingers splayed, her nails scraping against the cold floor as she pushed herself up. The darkness clung to her, trying to drag her back down. But she fought it. Asterisk fought it with every ounce of strength left in her asterisk. The figure hesitated. Mira looked up, meeting its glowing eyes, her heart pounding. Asterisk, not yet. Not yet, asterisk. She stood, her body shaking but resolute. With one final, desperate scream, she raised her hands and forced the light to flare back to life, burning, searing, tearing through the suffocating darkness. The figure screamed, its form splintering, cracking like fragile glass. The shadows recoiled, retreating, shrinking, until, asterisk nothing asterisk. The room was silent once more. But this time, the silence felt different. Myra's body still shook, but the weight of the darkness had lifted. The air was clear. The light, warm and bright, poured through the windows, casting a gentle glow across the room. She had won. For now, Mira stood in the center of the room, the last echoes of darkness fading into nothingness. The shadows that had once gripped her so tightly, suffocating her every breath, had finally receded. The air around her, though heavy with the remnants of fear, now felt lighter, as though the very room had been cleansed. She took a slow, tentative step forward, her legs still shaky from the weight of everything she had endured. Her fingers brushed against the wall, cold at first, but comforting in its solidity. The quiet was almost peaceful, though the faint tremor in her hands betrayed her calm exterior. She glanced toward the door. The handle was still there, untouched. The door she had once thought would be her escape. She could almost feel the pull of the darkness on the other side, the promise of it waiting for her return. But now, with every step she took away from it, the pull seemed weaker, less insistent. For a long moment, Mira stood there, considering what lay ahead. She could leave this place, step back into the world outside, and try to rebuild, try to live again without the constant weight of fear hanging over her. But she knew something that she hadn't before. That door, asterisk the door asterisk, was always open, waiting to be opened again. The darkness would never truly leave her. It had shaped her, marked her in ways she couldn't erase. The question wasn't whether she could escape it. It was whether she could learn to live with it, to face it, instead of letting it control her. The door might always be open, but it was up to her whether or not she walked through it again. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel trapped. The darkness might have claimed parts of her soul, but she was still here. She was still herself, and that was enough. Mira turned away from the door, stepping into the light of the room. She wasn't running anymore. Not from the shadows, not from her past. She had faced it all, and she had survived. For now, that was enough. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.